welcome. I'm Richard Topping, the president of the Vancouver School of Theology, and I'm just delighted to welcome you all to the online Somerville lecture for 2021. The Somerville lecture and retreat promotes spiritual vitality and community leadership. It's been made possible through the Somerville Fund for Spiritual Formation, which was established in appreciation of the pastoral presence and spiritual guidance of Archbishop T. David Somerville, who was the bishop in this diocese of New Westminster and also professor here at the Vancouver School of Theology. Just a word that tonight I'm at the Vancouver School of Theology, and so we meet on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Tonight it is an honor to welcome Martin Doblmeier as our 2021 Somerville speaker. He is an award-winning American documentary filmmaker, known for directing films for public television, including Bonhoeffer, The Power of Forgiveness, An American Conscience, the Reinhold Niebuhr story, and Backs Against the Wall, the Howard Thurman story. He holds degrees in religious studies, broadcast journalism, and honorary degrees in fine arts and humane letters. Since 1984, he's produced and directed more than 30 films focused on religion, faith, and spirituality. Martin combines a lifelong interest in religion with a passion for storytelling. Over the years, he's traveled on location to more than 40 countries to profile numerous religious leaders, spiritual communities, heads of state, and Nobel laureates. His films explore how belief can lead individuals to extraordinary acts, how spirituality creates and sustains communities, and how faith is lived in extraordinary ways. Abraham Joshua Heschel, Jewish rabbi and theologian, civil rights advocate, Holocaust survivor, and champion of interfaith dialogue, is the subject of the 2021 documentary Spiritual Audacity, produced and directed by Martin. We've all had the opportunity to watch the film, and tonight we want to engage Martin in a discussion of its themes and its importance. We're joined tonight by Rabbi Professor Laura Duhan Kaplan, who is the Director of Interreligious Studies and Professor of Jewish Studies at the Vancouver School of Theology. Your questions are welcome. And so as the discussion proceeds this evening, we encourage you to write them in the chat box so that we can bring them forward in the discussion. So I want to say welcome to Martin and Laura.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you so much, Martin, for being here. And I was hoping that I could ask you a first question. I assume that everyone here has either seen the film or is going to watch it very soon. I've seen the film twice and I love it. And I wish that every Christian could watch this film because it communicates so much about Judaism. Communicates about the importance of tikkun olam, the influence of the Hasidic movement, the legacy and the trauma of the Holocaust, the challenges of living in a Christian society that has historically had fraught relationships with Jews, the way that we are hardly a monolithic group of people who see eye to eye on everything, and also the way that for a generation and going into the future, the philosophy of Heschel really captured so much about the intersection of these aspects of Jewish life. And so I'm wondering what drew you as a Christian to Abraham Joshua Heschel?
And that's a great question. And the prophets too, that's another aspect of the story that we tried to bring out. Well, first of all, I want to say thanks to Jason and to Richard and to you, Laura, for the invitation to be part of this tonight. I really wanted to be in Vancouver with you all this evening and tomorrow. That was the plan long ago, months ago when we started talking about this, but it was not to be this year. So maybe I'll do one more film, and maybe next year I'll get a chance to get out to Vancouver. I have been doing films on religion, faith, and spirituality for over 30 years. Heschel's always been in the background. I've been thinking about when was the right time to do it. And I'm in the midst now of a series that we're doing called Prophetic Voices. And these were the great religious figures of the 20th century. So it includes Reinhold Niebuhr, Dorothy Day, Howard Thurman, and Abraham Joshua Heschel. And it was, I guess now about 2.5, 3 years ago, I did an interview with Susanna Heschel, the daughter that you saw in the film, the daughter of Abraham Heschel, who's also a brilliant scholar in her own right. She really is something else. And when I did the interview with her to appear in our film on Reinhold Niebuhr, to talk about the friendship between Reinhold Niebuhr and her father, Abraham Heschel, we had a conversation afterwards, and she said to me, frankly, would you be open after you finish this film on Niebuhr doing a film on my father? How do you say no to that? So it just became, I put it in the back of my mind, and I thought, well, if we can get an opportunity to do a series of these figures, these great figures of the 20th century, Heschel has to be one of them, because I think he really is one of the seminal, not just religious figures, but one of the great American stories of the 20th century. He really is. I mean, imagine he comes over from Europe during the Second World War. He escapes the Holocaust, barely gets over here. He's rescued as one of the 5 brilliant thinkers that's brought over to the United States by Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and so he barely escapes. He loses his mother and three of his sisters, and yet to read him over and over, you don't sense a notion of anger or revenge or vindictiveness. What you see is this continuous look for, in a sense, radical amazement about the world that God has created, always looking for who God is in his life, and always flipping everything around. It comes to America, and America is all about trying to figure out ways to justify the existence of God. And Heschel is the one who inverts all of that and says, no, it's about us coming to an understanding that God is the beginning place, and how is God, and that we are the center of God's concern. How revealing that is. And that's a total twist in understanding about the relationship between ourselves and to God. So for me, it was just been a brilliant walk these last many, many months putting the film together. And the response to the film has just been terrific. We're thrilled about it. I think in many ways because a lot of people knew of Heschel, but I think they were hungry for more. And the opportunity to do a documentary film about him is just, I think, an opportunity to sort of bring the story to the American people, and we were just thrilled with the response.
That is a great starting point answer. And I want to ask you a little bit more about the role of the idea of prophets in your film. So I really, really love Heschel's work on the prophets and his theology that you talk about in the film, that God is, okay, this is my paraphrase, the great heart of the universe, who really, really feels the joys and the sorrows of the creatures and is genuinely heartbroken when we do wrong and harm each other. And that the prophet is one who cannot help themselves from feeling these feelings along with God. And that's what moves them to speak. And the way you chose to present the film was to talk squarely about current events in American society that were important during Heschel's lifetime, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and you position him demonstrating to us what it is to live as a prophet. Can you tell us a little bit about why you made those choices?
Well, I think, first of all, from a filmmaking point of view, if you want to learn about his theology, you can read his work. But if you're going to make a film about him, I need to be able to show action, to be able to bring the drama of the story to being. And that was all there with Heschel. I mean, the truth of the matter is those pictures of Heschel at the front of the line in Selma, Alabama have become iconic American stories. It's just really amazing how many people that I've talked to over these last, couple of years that we've been involved with this story know that picture. It's famous. It's one of the most famous pictures in the American mid-20th century story. So for Heschel, that was an example of social action. He thinks in terms of social action as a prayer. The idea that I felt my legs were praying is a reflection of the fact that doing social action, changing the world as a better place, is a form of prayer. And I think as we, from a theological point of view, on the campuses all across this country, think about who we are and how we have to be thinking about our role in the world, that's the best example I can think of. I mean, in a sense, Heschel takes the example of the prophets onto himself. He embodies them. Not only because he does physically, you see him with the beard and the hair. He looks like what we imagine Elijah to look like. But the truth of the matter is, he did that because he was doing what he could do to internalize all the pain and suffering that he felt. You know, to read his letters and his work, we talk about how the prophets, he would always say that for everybody else, an injustice hurts deeply, but for a prophet, the prophets of the Old Testament, it was cosmic proportions. And I think in some ways, to read his letters, the hyperbole that he speaks with, it's just a sense that he's really suffering to see these great injustices, and he will not let it go. So he's going to pay whatever price it is. And I think in many ways, one of the ways that he mirrors the prophets is because he, like everybody else in the storyline, pays a price for the decisions they're going to make. He paid a price within his own academic community for being ostracized in many ways. It was not an easy road for him. We look now 50 years back on what had happened to Abraham Heschel, hold him up high in our history books. But the truth of the matter is, at the time, there was quite a bit of suffering internally for him, as far as within his own communities and the sort of the pushback that he was getting for being out there on the front lines in Selma. And that's a tragedy when you think about it. But that's the way he felt, as though he could be a reflection of the prophets that he so believed in.
I think another great answer that helps deepen our understanding of the film. So thank you for that. You talk about some of the challenges. So one of the challenges that you talk about in the film is what it was like for him to be a teacher from a Hasidic background, that is, a mystical background, someone who believes in fervent, performative prayer, at a time when that approach to prayer and spirituality, the film uses the word piety, but in my own mind I translate it into spirituality, at a time in American society where that was not a mainstream approach to Jewish spirituality. It is much more so now, but it wasn't then. And, you know, I'll say something and then ask you a question. So that's another way in which he was a pioneer, right? He was one of the teachers that helped bring that Hasidic spiritual approach into the mainstream through his presence at the Jewish Theological Seminary and the way he particularly brought it forward in an American idiom as a critique of materialism. All of that is just so beautiful. And again, we look back years later and we really resonate with the writings because I'm not even that young, but people of my Jewish generation were raised to find that a familiar part of Jewish spirituality. But it wasn't when Heschel brought it over. And I'm wondering, what did you learn about Jewish spirituality and tradition by making this film that was particularly new and wonderful to you?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'm not, I was born and raised Roman Catholic. So I have to say that this was a great education moment for me to be able to sort of immerse myself in this story. And so I don't profess to be a scholar of Judaism. I turn to you more often on this, Laura, than myself, of course. But for me, I think what I really enjoyed was to read Heschel's understanding and love of his faith. I think that's the first thing. He didn't study it like an academic would study it. He was first immersed in the love of God, and that what I think permeates everything that he does. So there's an interesting. The last thing he writes in his life, he's actually writing it in about 1971. It's called A Passion for Truth, and it's really a dialogue. He really does it as a dialogue between two Hasidic figures, the Baal Shem Tov, who we bring out in the film, who's got this extraordinary love and appreciation for everything in life. And life is a song for him. And yet, 100 years later, comes the Kotzker Rebbe, who's also Hasidic. And the Kotzker Rebbe sees that there's the possibility for evil and the turning of everything into something that goes from good to bad, and he's like the realist, the pragmatist. And so Heschel's writing about these two figures kind of in parallel at the end of his life. And it's really an interesting, for me as a Christian, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, this is a wonderful way to be walking around and seeing the world in that last year or two of his life, because the Christian example I came away with is almost as if there was a dialogue between St. Francis of Assisi and Reinhold Niebuhr. So, I think the world is such an incredible, beautiful place. Can you hear the songs of love? And Niebuhr says, don't you see what's the problem here? Human nature is always going to turn this into evil. Don't you see what's going on? And that's exactly the kind of the Hasidism that he was walking around with, that tension between the love of everything that's beautiful and possible in human nature, and also the darker side, because it's this constant tension between the good and the evil that's going on. And humanity reflects that. So for me, I just found that a really interesting way to look at him in the last years of his life, the balancing of those two things. It's sort of Niebuhrian in some ways, a Reinhold Niebuhr approach to it. But I think it was true to who Heschel was in that last year or two of his life.
I love that answer. You know, in the tradition of the way that the early Hasidic teachers come down to us, Hasidism is such a psycho-spiritual approach to religion that each Hasidic teacher taught from the perspective of what was going on with them personally, spiritually, what was their own search. And the Baal Shem Tov wanted to see everything, as you said, through that lens of a spiritual gift from God. And the Kotzker is like, oh, I'm such a troubled person, aren't we all? This is where we really have to wrestle with God. And the way you express it, it shows some of the complexity of Heschel's inner life, that he was able to live in both of those spiritual keys and put them together. And in his writing, you see that complexity as well. You know, on the one hand, calling everyone to radical amazement, seeing the presence of God hinted at in everything. On the other hand, some of those calls to responsibility that you highlight in the film and that we see in other places in his writings. And maybe that's part of why he has such a broad appeal, because he can really speak to people in different spiritual keys that we're at.
I think some of it too, Rabbi, might come from the idea that he had become this close friend with Reinhold Niebuhr. He taught most of his life at Jewish Theological Seminary, Heschel did. And just across the street was Union Theological Seminary. And here's this extraordinary figure, Reinhold Niebuhr. And Niebuhr had become a good friend of his, and beginning back in 1951, when Niebuhr writes this article, a review of Heschel's book, Man is Not Alone, and says this person, this young writer at the time, Heschel is destined to be a commanding force in the world of American religion, and really raised up Heschel in a way that he had not been raised before. And all of a sudden now, because of Reinhold Niebuhr, Heschel's on the map. He really is. And these two become friends. They take these famous walks all along Riverside Drive and up and down Broadway, and you can just imagine all these conversations about social injustice and Vietnam. And I think in some ways this was the Baal Shem Tov walking around with somebody who he could bounce ideas off of, the realist, the Christian realist, and the Baal Shem Tov talking about the way that we can think about life and the balance between mystery and meaning. I mean, Heschel one time says, look at the human face. Isn't it the perfect example of the balance between mystery and meaning? And I think that's what the two of them were always trying to figure out. What's the balance between those two things? Because I think Heschel probably was inclined towards the mystery. And yet at the same time, he was aware that he couldn't do that at the expense of the meaning. And that's why I think these two became really good friends. And one of the things that I didn't get a chance to mention in the Heschel film, but we have it in the Niebuhr film, was that one of the historic things that came out of this friendship, and it really is historic, is that these two men committed to each other that if the other one dies, the other one who remains will preach at their funeral. Now, this is at a time when, interfaith relations is nowhere like what it is today. This was really, in some ways, from a religious point of view, an historic invitation. Made me think about who would I want to have, who would I want to assign now to preach at my funeral? And then Heschel was able to preach at Reinhold Niebuhr's funeral, and it really was something else. But I think a reflection about how far their friendship had come and developed, and really how far, interfaith relations had come and how important it was. And they knew that they were in some ways emblematic of what was possible.
And that is just a really beautiful thing to remember, that on the one hand, we have a theologian who was formative for modern Judaism and a theologian who was formative for modern Christianity. And those thoughts, right, that became formative, some of them were developed through a shared personal interreligious dialogue.
And I think that it says too that both of them had the capacity to listen. I mean, we always think in terms of theologian as sort of from them to us. But I think in many ways, I think you look at these two men, these two human beings, and they were constantly on the search to understand better meaning and mystery. And I think they were open always to learning from the other. And I think ultimately listening to each other. I think for me, people always ask, what's the most important thing in terms of being a filmmaker? I think the one thing that holds whatever work we do together is the ability to listen. I do think that listening, your ability to listen, I've learned over the years, is a reflection of your own spiritual health. I've seen it so much in my own life that at the times when I feel as though I'm a little spiritually challenged or I'm out of balance or however I want to think about that, I just don't listen well. For whatever reason, there are all other kind of voices going on inside my head. I think listening can be a really good indicator of your own spiritual health. And apparently these two men were capable of listening to each other in addition to being able to write on their own.
That is a really important teaching. I'm just going to say one more thing and you can respond to it, and then we'll check in with Richard, who I think is managing the structure and the time. I'm also struck by you talking about the balance between meaning and mystery. And I feel like that's a good 3-word phrase for capturing some of my experience while watching your film. On the one hand, you take a set of raw materials and you create a meaning out of it. You tell a historical story, and weaving into that historical story, you also tell a theological story and an interpersonal story and a biography. And in a way, you set out the meaning of those events for us. But the way that you put them together, there are so many places for each of us to enter that film in our own personal way. We can remember where we were during these events. We can connect emotionally to the events. We can reflect on some of the prophetic and spiritual messages in the film. So it's just a wonderful participatory experience for the audience to view this film and really kind of begin to reflect on their own ethics and spirituality through it.
Well, thank you. I also hope too that there would be people who could watch this film with no historical context. A younger generation who, for them, the civil rights, that was something from the 20th century. We don't, we know about it. We saw a picture or two. The Vietnam War, boy, that was mostly in black and white. But I still want people to be able to look at a story about Abraham Joshua Heschel and see that there's a universal character to his quest for God and his universal character to his understanding of who God is in his life and what it drove him to do. So where the situation and the circumstances might be very different for him, the universal character of what it was he was looking for and the answers that he came up with apply just as much today as they might have then. And that's what I'm hoping, that the film actually can continue to talk to different generations who feel more and more removed from the Vietnam War and more removed from the situation of civil rights. Taking those victories for granted in some ways, and that's a dangerous thing too. But the truth of the matter is, I think that Heschel is that kind of character that he will, 100 years from now, will still be able to pull out his books, the books that you've studied, God in Search of Man. Those works are universal works, and I think they will speak to us in 100 years from now. And my challenge was to tell a story that actually could, sort of transcend a generation, to look at him, to tell a story that was fixed in his timeline. So I made a very clear decision when I was actually making the film that I wasn't going to sort of reference anything that's happening in our culture today. Let the film tell the story from his life to the end of his life, and tell it as richly as I possibly could. But then in 10 years from now, you can still look at the film and then apply it to whatever's happening in the world in this country today, and make it as rich and as meaningful then. And it doesn't feel as though it's a time capsule. It's Heschel's story in that particular time, but all the universal characters still remain.
Well, I know I said I would turn it over to Richard, but I love your answer so much that I do want to share with you that today I was looking at my notes that I wrote in my journal the first time I watched your film a few months ago. And one of them was that I thought by opening with the civil rights movement, you placed the story so squarely into exactly what are the most important social issues in the United States today. So
Well, yes, but let me say too, I mean, racism is America's original sin. It's the original sin of this country, and it's not going to go away. It'll ebb and flow in terms of being garnering attention on the headlines. There'll be moments in which it's being focused. You know, what happened in Minneapolis, the George Floyd murder, brought it right up to the surface again. But whether it's Rodney King or George Floyd or whatever happens, the racial history in this country hasn't been dealt with properly yet. It's not going away. And so what happened in Selma was an historic moment, but it's still going to be relative. Tragically, it's going to be relative years from now until we figure out how we can actually more adequately and sufficiently deal with the problem of race in this country.
thanks.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions here, Martin, that have been asked online. At first, I wondered if there would be any, but there's plenty now. So the first one here from Janet Peak, she said, did you decide what points of Heschel's life made him think differently than many others? The intersection of times in his life where he stepped out of a usual frame. His actions were courageous. So just a question about what you think are the formative elements and what made him the kind of person that he was.
Well, I think obviously he would be a very different figure for us had he not come to this country. I mean, it's just impossible to imagine what could have happened had he stayed in Europe, had he stayed in Poland. You know, the Nazis were onto him in 1938, and he had to get out. He was actually deported out of Germany and wound up taking sanctuary in the UK, and then finally made his way over to the United States. I think the combination of what happened to him, his upbringing, you know, he's also a child growing up in the ashes of World War I. I mean, he's in Poland in World War I. He saw what was happening, the devastation there. So, I mean, he's really a product of what happened in Europe, and he brings all of that experience to this country. And I think that undergirds everything when he talks in terms of looking at the world with awe and radical amazement. I do in some ways understand why his peers in the academic world at Jewish Theological Seminary, you know, could turn and say, well, aren't you angry about this? Where was God during all of this? How can this have possibly happened? We were people who've been abandoned. How did this happen? And you're answering by saying, look at the world with radical amazement. And I can understand that there could be natural tension there, but that I think was natural for Heschel. I mean, this is the way that he chose to look at the world, despite the tragedy that came into his life. And as I've read the works, I keep thinking, is it there that I'm just not seeing it? But I think this is a man who dearly loved God and thought that his role in this world was to understand how God was calling him to be a prophetic voice at this time and to embody all of that for everybody around him. And I think that's what Heschel did. He just decided that this was going to be his calling, his prophetic witness.
Thank you, Martin. Martin, you mentioned Heschel's close friendship with Niebuhr and how that was formative for both of them. Could you comment on his friendship, say, with Martin Luther King Jr. and how that was formative? I mean, you make a point in the film of talking about the kind of resonant piety between Heschel and the Black church. Could you say more about that?
Well, remember, Heschel is about almost a generation older than Martin Luther King. So Heschel's born in 1907. King is born in 1929. So he's almost a generation older. And yet these two people recognized in something special in each other. First of all, they're brilliant men. I mean, I don't want to underestimate the fact that these two men are brilliant men. And I think they automatically connected also because, as we say in the film, Arnold Eisen, the former chancellor at Jewish Theological Seminary, said that they saw in each other a kindred DNA. The notion that one comes from the Hasidic royalty, the other one comes from a long line of established ministers. There's just a sense that they're looking through the same lens at the world and trying to figure out what's going to be happening here. But it's the friendship forms in 1963. It's this race and religion gathering that Heschel attends, and he's given a platform at that gathering in 1963, which of course is the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's an historic event in American racial history. But Heschel gets up and he stands in front of everybody, and he literally dazzles the audience. He says that racism is the maximum amount of hatred for the minimum amount of reason. And I think he hooked Martin Luther King at that time. I imagine if Martin was there, he would have walked up and said, "Who is this guy? And I have to get to know this guy." And over the next, Heschel already has a reputation since 1963, so it's 12 years after he's published Man Is Not Alone. So Heschel's on the map. That's why he gets the invitation to give the keynote. But these two form a friendship, and tragically, it doesn't last that long. I mean, they actually, and I think the foundation is not just academic intelligence or biblical background or studies. I think the foundation of it is trust. I think the foundation is trust, that they could trust each other with what they were really thinking and feeling, the fears that they have, the concerns. And I think that the trust with any relationship, the foundation has to rest on trust. And these two fundamentally, I think, trusted each other with their own sort of spiritual well-being.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, may I bring forward another question from the
Yes, please.
question box? I'm going to paraphrase this question a little bit. It's asked by Amy Haynes and echoed by Harry Meyer. Martin, you've done several films about public theologians, right? Theologians who made a huge difference to public discourse. What do you think is the role of a public theologian now in our time, particularly when, say, in Canada, the public sphere is so relatively secularized, and in the US, religion is so highly politicized? I'm sure you've thought a great deal about public theologians in our time.
Yeah, I can confirm your sort of assessment of what's happening, not so much in Canada, because I have to spend a little bit more time back up in Canada. I love Canada. I can't wait to get back to Vancouver. I love Vancouver in particular. But I can tell you that in America, yes, the religion politics landscape has been hijacked by what I would consider the conservative evangelical right. They have their place. They have their right to speak out. But the truth of the matter is, I think that's come at the expense of what I would think of more progressive voices. I don't use the word liberal or conservative in the same sense, but I just think the people who really see their obligation is to take and internalize a gospel and a tradition and a history and a sacred text, and to see how that applies to the particular social and political issues of the day. And I think part of the reason why we know who Abraham Heschel is and Reinhold Niebuhr is because the media in the 20th century was asking the big questions. They were asking the moral questions. We had just come out of this horrific war, Second World War. We were wondering, what does all of this mean? What has humanity finally shown its darkest moment? We had dropped the nuclear bomb. We now were in the nuclear age. The threats were everywhere. The failure, the notion of American exceptionalism was beginning to pass away quickly in this country. And everybody was turning to the moral voices to say, well, what can we do to redeem some of this? How can we redeem ourselves? And they were turning to Niebuhr, and they were turning to Abraham Joshua Heschel to ask some of these bigger, more profound questions. I think the problem is we've stopped asking the questions. And part of the reason why is because I think we have to be training in a theological way the people to raise those kind of questions again, because they have the concerns and the issues haven't really gone away. We're just not asking the right questions, because theology can answer some of those questions by sort of sending us in the proper direction. So I'm always asked, well, where are the prophetic voices in the 21st century? And the problem is, even if they're there, they're not getting the same kind of attention. The media is not really interested in asking those kind of questions anymore, and they're not giving them the kind of platform. But the truth of the matter is, I think that doesn't take any of the responsibility that we have to prepare people and get them ready to go out there and actually continue to do tikkun olam, to transform the world into a better place, to make it a better place. That's the obligation we all carry with us.
Martin, this is a more cinematic question. It comes from Linda Robertson. She's talking about the film Selma, in which I haven't seen it, but the question says where Heschel has been changed into a Greek Orthodox Christian priest. Did you see the movie, and why do you think the movie decided to erase him that way?
Yeah, I did, and there's no Heschel in the movie. I mean, I think it's a major oversight that was lost. And I mean, I talked to Jews of all stripes, conservative and Orthodox, Reform. They've all said, well, where's Heschel? I mean, we hold Heschel up as one of the most important prophetic voices there in Selma, and he was totally ignored. I think that was just, I think it's a major oversight in the film. I mean, I can't explain why the filmmaker didn't do something that they chose not to do. But for me, I think that it's really negligent to not really sort of celebrate that, because, Heschel was with King the morning of that march. They were all together in the same house. They prayed together before that march began. I mean, to then sort of summarily take Heschel out of that storyline when he's clearly in the front of the line right there, risking his life and his personal safety and his professional career, like everybody else. I think it was a big mistake. So,
thank you. Go ahead, Laura. Do you have a question?
I was just looking at the chat box.
Okay. Well, there's a comment here that's interesting. So, watching the movie, especially the piece about Heschel's involvement around Nostra Aetate, about converting. And the writer, it's not a question, but a comment that, well, very often Heschel is talked about as being prophetic, speaking truth to power. There's a lot of diplomacy in his work, is a comment here. What would you think of that, Martin?
now that's a great comment. Well, the document is called Nostra Aetate. It means in our time. It's Latin for in our time. And it's the final work of really a 3 or almost a 4-year program by the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church's efforts in the early 1960s to figure out what its role was going to be in a modern world. And they addressed a number of different questions, major concerns about liturgical practice. And one of the major questions and concerns was, how will we be interacting with faiths other than our own in the future? And in particular, there was concern about how is it going to address its own history of anti-Semitism, and how it's going to be able to confess that and then move forward. And Heschel becomes really a significant player. I mean, he's part of the consulting group for the American Jewish Committee, the AJC, and they go over to Rome, and they're back and forth constantly. The council met really in the fall of 62, 63, 64, and 65. And every session they would all come together and talk about progress on particular documents, and then all the bishops would go back home, and they would be home for the next 9 months, and they would convene back in Rome again in the fall. But Heschel was really working on this across those 4 years, moving the Catholic Church towards its better understanding of how it's going to be dealing with its own guilt for what had happened over 2,000 years. I think, yes, we want to remember those pictures of him at the line in Selma. I think there's a more lasting legacy of Heschel in the Nostra Aetate moment, where he's actually helping to shape this behemoth of the Catholic Church and how it's going to be thinking about its relationship with other faith traditions going forward. And look at all that's come from it. I mean, I was thinking in 2018 at the killing, the shooting that happened at Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And then the next day, Pope Francis comes out onto the platform and says, what happened in Pittsburgh, half a world away, the killing there, the atrocity there, deeply affects all of us. It hurts us deeply to learn about this. When they hurt, we hurt. I don't think something like that would have happened had there not been an opportunity to sort of form a new understanding of the relationship between the Catholic experience and the Jewish experience that came out of Nostra Aetate. There's now a formal recognition between the Vatican and Israel That happened in early 1990s, 1992. That probably wouldn't have happened had it not been for the whole new enlightenment that came out of Nostra Aetate. So these are really historic moments that you can directly attribute Heschel's behind the scenes activity to. The person who posed the question is right. It's more diplomatic, but it was diplomatic again out of a sense of brilliance, Heschel's brilliance, but also trust. I think fundamentally the Pope and the committees at the Second Vatican Council trusted Heschel to be looking for a path forward that really served all of them. And they trusted enough to be able to sort of conform the document and make sure that it did not continue to talk about how Catholics had been responsible for the killing of Jesus, which was a really big stumbling block. But Heschel was able to get that removed, and I think ultimately make these major transformations that come out of the Catholic Church that I think continue to ripple now even a half a century later.
Mm. Do you have one, Laura? Go ahead.
I have a question. It's not exactly in the chat box. I'm thinking about this lovely moment in the film when Susanna Heschel is talking about her father's early childhood, right? And being from an aristocratic family within his community of origin in a line of Hasidic rebbes and teachers, and how his family would stand him up and say, "You're going to talk to people now. You're going to do a little bit of Torah teaching here." And it really struck me how this is a person who from early childhood was told, you are going to be a leader. You can even see that in the way that his family pushed him forward into all the different levels of education that he found himself immersed in his teens and early 20s. And what I love about that is you paint a portrait of someone who was told, you're going to speak up, and then terrible events happen and he speaks up. He does what he was asked to do. And there are so many people that we're all aware of who are raised that way and yet who don't step up or who become corrupt, really. And I wonder if you could say something about your sense of what it takes for us to step up.
Well, you're at a seminary, you're training people who are beginning to sort of shape a notion of who they want to be. Isn't there something in all of us that would probably be a little jealous that here's this boy who is not, he's told from day one that you're going to be this, you're part of this tradition. How in some ways wonderful it is that he's got his life's mission right from the get-go, and he's being celebrated and held up and honored as a result of it. So that to me, I mean, he's not, 45 years old and trying to figure out who he is in the world. That's not Abraham Joshua Heschel. He's already decided, I know who I am and who I have to be and what I have to do. And he's out there. How he's going to apply that becomes the daily question. What he's going to write about becomes the daily question. But I don't think I don't think he really had that sort of grand question about who he was in the world in his life. That was not Abraham Joshua Heschel. And the other thing that I think too is sort of clear about it. I see Heschel in some ways like a prodigy. He has this gift, but just like a musician who realizes from age 5, boy, you're really good on the violin. It's practice, practice, practice makes the great musician. It's the gift and the practice. And Heschel had the gift. He had the legacy, the DNA. But Susanna Heschel will tell you that my father would stay at JTS doing his writing and studying. He was reading all the time. He'd stay there till 11 o'clock at night and walk across the hall, come home. So this man combined the gift, the DNA, the tradition, plus the basic hard work. He was willing to do all the hard work because I think fundamentally he loved it. He loved understanding who he was supposed to be in the world and took that on full force. And I think that's really admirable. And I think that becomes a great example. I mean, it's not just about going online, going out and standing on a line and marching up and down with a banner. It's about understanding your tradition, your sacred text, and how it all weaves together, and then putting that thing into practice that that you really feel as though God's calling you to do.
Here's a sort of fun question. What will be the subject of your next film? I suppose one of the things you said in your comments on the Heschel film is that it came out of your work on the Niebuhr film. These projects seem to be related to one another.
And this one continues. The next one is related to this.
Okay.
So I've been sort of carrying around with me now for a couple of years the notion that I want to do a film we've begun now. We've just already started to launch the film. It's a film called Sabbath. It'll be a 2-hour special for public television in probably in April of 2023. So it'll take us the next year plus to actually make the film and then release it into public television. And it's a look at the commandment to rest. It's a look at the understanding that we are using that commandment to rest as an opportunity to gather and to worship. But Sabbath also leads us into the idea of how do we treat the environment? Do we understand the cycles of the rhythms of our lives? How do we think about time in general? Yes, I think I was sort of reinforced because of Heschel's book on Sabbath, which I read several times during the course of the making of this last film on Heschel. But I think it's a really rich topic. It gives us an opportunity to sort of get artsy and creative in a different kind of way. My role when I do a film like a biographical film like on Niebuhr or Dorothy Day or Abraham Heschel is I do everything I can to find the drama and to stay close to the historical storyline. There's nothing in the film that I took what you would call, that you would in a drama take, well, I took historic license. We don't do any of that in the documentary film. Everything in the film, to the best of our knowledge, is absolutely spot on accurate. It's been checked and double checked. With a film like Sabbath, we're going to get a little bit more creative latitude to interpret ideas about the connectedness to the earth and the rhythms of life and time and things like that. So it's a kind of a different artistic kind of expression for us, but I think very deeply when we think about it, theologically grounded. So we're excited about doing that.
Wonderful.
Well, you've got some questions in the chat box that are fun in a different way. So I'll just combine two of them and paraphrase that. And then I see yet another question just arrived that is less niche and really good. So one question is, have you run across people who thought of Heschel as reactionary in any way? And what does Stanley Hauerwas think of your films?
Well, that's great. Well, I'll take the last one. I'm not quite sure what reactionary, how that would play out in sort of thinking about that. I mean, most of the people who come to the Heschel film think of Heschel as a great character, and they're grateful to have an opportunity not only to revisit his life, but to be able to share his life story. So that's, unless, Laura, you have a different idea of what the writer of the question might have in mind when they say reactionary. I love Stanley Hauerwas. He's the real deal. And I was in Duke with him in 3 years ago, to do the interview with him for the film Reinhold Niebuhr. And he gave me one of the greatest lines. He said, and kind of how Stanley Hauerwas, well, I love Reinhold Niebuhr. I just disagree with everything he said. And that's Stanley. So we had a great time together, and I share with him my Dorothy Day film, because Dorothy Day's sense of pacifism and Stanley Hauerwas's notion of pacifism are much more in line than Reinhold Niebuhr for Stanley Hauerwas. Stanley Hauerwas is a fundamentally hard-nosed pacifist, as Dorothy Day was. Niebuhr's not. Heschel's not. Would not be considered a pacifist. They would sort of aspire to nonviolence as an initial response, but they would not deem themselves pacifists. Dorothy Day is a pacifist. I think Stanley Hauerwas would say that too. And also Stanley Hauerwas believes that the church really is underused in its potential for how its role, and that Niebuhr really sold short the notion of church and the role that it can play in creating an alternative reality to the culture that was at large in America at the time during Niebuhr's time. And so that's Hauerwas's take on the failures of Niebuhr really sort of step up to what he felt as though Christ had set as an example, both for church and for the notion of responding to the evils in the world.
There's another question here that I think Laura saw pop up while she was asking that one, but it's a question about Heschel's gracious posture of interfaith. He seems to be a person, I think this is the sort of background, it's not in the question, but who reached out between faiths and yet held to a particular faith tradition. What do you think he has to teach us on that?
Oh, I think that's, I think Heschel's a great example of saying that you can engage with people of other faith traditions without any compromise to your own. I think that's the fundamental message that you see in Abraham Heschel's life. There was never a question as to whether or not he was going to convert to Christianity. I mean, he felt as though Judaism was, his faith was his home. He loved Israel, he loved his faith. That wasn't going to change. And yet at the same time, he could engage with Christians. You saw throughout the course of his life here in the United States, especially. And he goes and gives his talk. He gets invited in 1965 to go across the street and take a visiting fellowship at Union Theological Seminary. Of course, it's instigated by Reinhold Niebuhr, who gets his friend Heschel to come over and sort of take a visiting fellowship at Union. But he gives this wonderful speech, like we talk about this in the film, No Religion is an Island. Now, the title of it is kind of paraphrased from Thomas Merton's No Man is an Island, which had become a best-selling book a number of years earlier. It's kind of in the air. But Heschel gives this wonderful talk, and he talks about, we all are human beings. There's no sense of being, religious isolationism is over. And it's no longer a time for us to fight with each other. The common enemy that we have is nihilism. The sense that life has no meaning whatsoever. That's what we have an opportunity, a challenge to confront, and that's what I think he was really focused on. He didn't have a lot of emotional space for people who didn't have any sense of God in the world and any sense of meaning in the world. This was a man who understood God, and for him, understood God's call to him. And that was his objective. And if you didn't get it, he was probably going to move on.
It was very nice that you mentioned Merton in your answer, because there was a question about the relationship. Someone was listening to you speak about the film and hearing Mertonese a little, and so you drew that connection.
Well, I have a little of that, but these people all found each other. I mean, they just kind of found each other. This is New York in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and they just all kind of found each other. I think that's a brilliant thing when you think about it. It was a great center, a place to be. Susanna Heschel tells the story that one night as a 13 or a 14-year-old, she comes home, and who's a guest in the house? Dorothy Day. So Heschel is inviting other people to come in and get involved. I mean, they didn't have any real connection. There's no record of Heschel ever going down to the Catholic Worker and spending time at the Catholic Worker. But Heschel wanted to engage with Dorothy Day and talk to her over dinner about her commitment, her understanding of God and the world. They may have met each other at the Second Vatican Council. I know that Heschel was there for extended periods of time. I know Dorothy Day was there in Rome. I think particularly in 64, might have been in 65 as well. So it's possible they connected over there, but they were certainly connecting in the Heschel home. And Susanna will say this is now possible. She recalls having nuns come over for dinner, and they would never have come over to the home of a Jewish rabbi. Never would have happened back in the 40s and 50s. But here it is. It's Heschel's moment, and he's creating these kind of opportunities and inspiring people to say, look, we have so much more in common than we do that separates us.
Thank you.
There is one question that has appeared both in the chat box and in the Q&A box. And someone is asking the question, so I'll give my answer to their question before I turn it over to you. Someone is asking the question, could someone who is an atheist find value in Heschel's book, The Sabbath? And I would say absolutely yes, as long as you're comfortable with a suggestive, literary, philosophical style of writing, and you believe that people have an inner life. But my other part of my answer is, well, to get a really good answer to that question, they might have to wait until your film on the Sabbath comes out.
And we're actually going to be asking that kind of question because we think that the notion of Sabbath doesn't only apply to people of a faith tradition. I mean, I would answer the question with a question. I would say, do you feel stressed out? Do you feel as though life is sort of out of control? That any sense of time, especially now during COVID,
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but there are times when I'm getting up and I'm not exactly sure what day it is. And I don't think I'm losing my mind. It's just that there's a similarity to so many of the days now living in a COVID moment. And if all of that's sort of playing out for you, I think that you could find within Heschel's work on the Sabbath, yes, it's a theological, spiritual treatise, but the truth of the matter is, I think it's a Judaic treatise too. I mean, it ripples with notions of Judaism. But the truth of the matter is, I think that if you're trying to understand the rhythms and cycles of your life, and what it actually means to be alive in this world, and that being alive sometimes means taking a rest, and that we can actually build a cathedral, when in some cases a place, a space. It's more about building a space and time. I think there's be plenty for a person who doesn't necessarily profess to a faith, or a nun, meaning a person who's spiritual but not religious. I think the Sabbath can actually be a great benefit. And also too, don't be discouraged. It's a short read, right, Laura? It's not a big book.
Mhm.
You can put it down in a weekend and read it a second and a third time. But I think it's just a terrific read, and I think it's one of his enduring works.
There's another question here, Martin, which follows on this, and it's about Brueggemann's understanding of Sabbath. We were talking about this a little earlier, and Heschel's, and what commonality you see. Maybe you've talked about Brueggemann being important. You're doing work on Brueggemann around your movie, so maybe this is a bit of a trailer for the movie that's yet to come.
Yeah. Well, of course, I went out to Walter Brueggemann lives in Traverse City, Michigan, which is. We're going soon, because by January, February, and March, it's tough. We tried it the last time to get into Traverse City. We arrived, all the equipment couldn't get in. There was snow. It was tough going. So that's where Walter is. But we're going to see Walter in the next couple of weeks and talk to him specifically about his really seminal book called Sabbath as Resistance. And he sees it as the way to resist the demands, the requirements of a contemporary culture. And the distinction, I think, for Brueggemann here is that Brueggemann is adamant about the fact that somewhere along the line, going back into the ancient texts, Sabbath morphed into an obligation to worship, to come together and to worship. That was never, you talked to Walter, that was never the intention of the commandment that was given to Moses. And so he goes back to the idea that it is a call to rest, not only rest in terms of how we rest our bodies, but also how we rest the land, how we forgive debts, how we think in terms of giving time to those that are dependent on us to be free. So we have of course taken Sabbath to be the obligation to gather, and that's been now really the common understanding, especially in the Christian world. And so we'll sort of rub up against that, but I think that that's really Brueggemann's main theory, that thesis, that his biblical understanding is that it was not ever intended as a call for worship. It was a call to rest.
Thank you. You're getting comments that are, if I translated them, they're amens to your comments on Sabbath here.
And they need translations.
Well, no, I'm just, they're not translated. They're longer statements, but I'm just summarizing them by saying amen.
Well, these are great questions, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to do it. So, and this is what we make these films for. I'll talk about this tomorrow in the class that we'll do together, Richard, but I think of this as narrative theology. Here's an opportunity to take theological concepts, theological ideas, and actually see them embodied in people. Heschel can talk all day long about the notion of how we're called by God to be partners in the transformation of the world. But when you see him walking arm in arm with Martin Luther King Jr., who comes from a different tradition, has a different history, a different faith background, arm in arm, that becomes the embodiment of working together, partnering with God in the transformation of the world. So theology becomes embodied in what they were trying to do. And for me, telling that story becomes a form of narrative theology. And I love doing it. We've been doing it now. I'll do it until we can't do it anymore.
Well, Martin, I know you're not looking at the chat box, but what you just said was actually an answer to the most recent question that came in.
Right.
That's a definition of prophecy, isn't it?
Yeah, see in the future.
Well, friends, it's 7 p.m. and we said we'd be together for an hour, and this has just been rich. Thank you so much, Martin, for a wonderful discussion this evening and for this really important and inspirational film on the life of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. I was deeply informed by it, and I've already begun doing some reading because of the influence of this film. And I want to thank Laura too for your engagement this evening in this beautiful congregation, for the work that you do every day at VST. And last but not least, thank you to Iman Zandroto, who is running our technology this evening as a very fine expert. And I want to thank everyone who's attended tonight for your delightful questions. What a rich discussion. Tomorrow we'll be on at 10 a.m. until noon, and Jason Biasi will host our conversation tomorrow, and we look forward to seeing you all then. Thank
I want to say a special thanks to Jason, because he was the one who brought us all together. So thank you, Jason.
Indeed. Wonderful.
Thank you, Martin and Richard.
Pleasure, Laura. Thank you. It's great to meet you. Thank you for what you're doing.
Well.